Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this Appendix N video I'm going to be talking about this book here, 30 Days of Worldbuilding, an author's step-by-step guide to building fictional worlds by Angeline Trevina. Okay, so to start with, as you can clearly see on the cover of this book, it says workbook here, and in the introduction the author talks a little bit about her history with writing fiction and building fictional worlds, and describes that often one of the greatest challenges to a writer can be creating this world and knowing what you need to detail and what you need to focus on. This book has been designed as a workbook to help with that. It's black and white interior, 85 pages long, and there's a lot of blank space on the pages because you're really supposed to fill this in like a workbook. Now, to be honest, I'm not really down with writing in books, but there's nothing to stop me photocopying the pages or just using the prompts inside that. Now, the way this workbook functions is it breaks down the process of world building into 30 steps or prompts, and then there's a few little extra bits and pieces at the end. And the idea is that if you followed one of these prompts each day for a month, answering them, performing the exercises that are given within, by the end of that month you would have a workable fantasy or fictional world. Now obviously this book is aimed more at writing than it is at RPGs, but as we all know, certainly in D&D and stuff like that, unless you want to use a pre-generated campaign world, which if you do, there's nothing wrong with that. However, certainly for me, part of the appeal of D&D and games like that is creating your own fantasy campaign world. As I spoke a little in the introduction video to this playlist, I'm currently in the process of preparing a fantasy world inspired by the sort of colonial America, sort of black powder era, and I'm going to be using this book to do that. I may do some videos covering how I answer these specifically, or they might go in my podcast or blog, I'm not sure yet, but I've really enjoyed reading this book, so I wanted to mention it in this Appendix N playlist. So what sort of thing do you get inside? Well, effectively each of the prompts gives you, let me hold this up, I don't know if you'll be able to see that, gives you a sort of a quick write-up after the prompt and then a certain amount of blank space to fill it in. So if we look at day one, the prompt for that is genre and setting. Now, the author talks a little bit about how genre can have a big impact on the setting and how the scope of a campaign world or a fictional world may be different depending on your genre. The example given here is a space opera might require an entire galaxy with multiple planets, each with their own world building requirements. You might be mapping a simple single spaceship, or for an epic fantasy, you're probably going to be creating a vast sort of fantasy world. And there's half a blank page at the bottom which says write a brief description of your setting and your genre. Lovely jubbly. So we move on to day two's, and I'm not going to go through all of these, I'm just going to give you a bit of a flavour of it. So day two is draw your map. And the author reminds you that this doesn't need to be a beautiful work of art, as long as it's useful to you as you write, or in our case, as you're creating your adventures, your plot hooks, whatever, for your RPG campaign. The author says this will become your absolute go-to piece of information. So it's important you keep it beside you as you write and update it as you need to. And that's something that applies equally for RPG games. It's handy to have that map there to reference so you can make sure you're getting things right. You're not sort of telling your players that there's a village 2 miles to the north and the next time they come to play you've forgotten and you tell them it's 20 miles to the north, because you can bet that even if you forgot, your players won't have forgot. So having like a little map, even if it's just a sketch one, can be very handy. And there's a page and a half for you to draw your map on. And the author says, obviously, if you're using digital means, etc., you can always glue them in. Although, like I say, I'll probably just keep them in like a separate file, but follow the prompts as I go along. So we're going to skip ahead a few days now to day 7. The prompt for that is sapient species. What are the sapient species in your world? Is it humans? Is it only humans? So in your typical fantasy game, you might have elves, dwarves, witches, whatever. In sci-fi, you might have alien species. There's a lot of variety, but the author starts to give you the idea here that you should start thinking about how these species interrelate with each other and how many resources and how much area of land on your map that you drew earlier the races are going to require. And again, there's like a page and a half blank here for you to detail that in. And I think it's a wise idea that you start thinking about how these groups are going to relate to each other and how many different species you want in your game or in your book at this point, since I think personally it'd be a lot easier to consider this from the start rather than try and shoehorn something else in later. Day 8, the prompt is food. What food can characters grow, rear or hunt? What needs to be imported? What can they afford to buy? And what is reserved only for the wealthy? And I like this because food is often something that gets skimmed over, certainly in RPG games. You know, most of the time, if you've got a bit of time, you'll have a bit of a breather, you'll scoff down some rations to get some hit points back or whatever, and then you move on. Or at best, you might rock into some sort of fantasy tavern, and you might ask what's on the menu, and you get some stew or gruel or like a chicken leg or whatever, and on you go. But and obviously this book's coming from like a fiction point of view, as I say, but still sort of thinking about what types of crops are available and what stuff has to come in via trade routes could give you some interesting plot lines, because obviously, to use a stereotypical fantasy world as an example, you're going to have carts coming in, they're going to need people to protect them. Maybe the PCs can make some coin by protecting some trade caravans. Someone's going to need to actually drive the caravans, take the food, etc. Someone's going to need to unpack it. It's going to need to be got to the tavern or whatever where it's actually sold out. How is it sold out? Is there a market? They're all very interesting questions that sort of spiral out from the prompts that are provided in the book. And again, blank space is provided for you to write that in. So let's skip ahead a few more days now, and we start as you sort of get to around about sort of 13, 14 on the points in here. You start sort of drilling down a little bit into the civilized areas and considering more sort of like the social and economic sort of effects of civilization and towns, etc. So, for instance, day 15, the prompt is law and order. Who's responsible for law and order? Who sets the rules? How are they decided? Who polices them? Who hands down the sentences? Etc. So, and the author reminds you that if your map covers more than a single country or an area, there might be different systems of law in place in different areas of your game world, which I think is something definitely worth considering. And considering how often player characters get into trouble or potentially run afoul of the law, it's worth considering that if and when they do get caught for some of their actions and their hijinks, are they going to be dragged up in front of a judge? Is there some sort of trial by ordeal? If a sentence is handed down, how does that get carried out? It's all stuff that's worth considering. And obviously you don't have to have it sort of all tied down and locked down 100%. And the author says that throughout this book. But just sketching in the rough idea will help you that if like unexpectedly one of the player characters gets nabbed by the local constabulary, at least you'll have a sort of rough idea and you can use that to portray this aspect of your game world consistently. So that's a very important thing. Okay, we're going to skip ahead a few more days to day 22, which is religious and spiritual belief structures. Now, obviously, particularly in something like D&D, where you've got clerics, divine powers that characters are using, it's very important to at least have some idea of the structure of deities, how their religions work. Is there any conflict between different religions? What's the relationship between religions and the more sort of temporal rulers of society, the more political rulers of society? The author advises you to think carefully about the day-to-day impact your religion has on characters, both the believers and the non-believers. Perhaps the calendar revolves around religious festivals, perhaps the working week, or maybe even school terms. What impact do the rulers and commandments of your religion have? Are they enshrined in law, or are they at odds with the law? So there's a lot of interesting things to think about there, which I think could add a lot of depth and potential points for uncovering plot and adventure in your campaign world. And again, there's space to write down a few ideas here. There's obviously prompts to cover like magic and various fantasy aspects like that, but I'm going to skip straight ahead to near the end to day 28. The prompt is historic wars. Now, given in most sort of fantasy campaign settings, there tends to be a lot of history that's occurred before the game, and often there are large empires that have warred with each other, have crumbled to dust, that form a rationale for there being dungeons, all these ancient races, monsters, etc. It's worth just like considering how the past has shaped your world. And as the author says, what scars remain from wars fought in your world? What monuments and reminders are there? So think of that scene in the Lord of the Rings film when they're walking between those two cliffs, and there's those two huge statues there of like ancient kings. I forget the exact details. It's been a while since I've watched the film, but I think they're statues of ancient kings. And even without any great deal of explanation to that, it implies that there is a previous history and that something went down on that site worthy of being commemorated with those two huge statues. As Angeline says, wars can change huge things in your world. Borders, governments, religions, various freedoms we all take for granted. It can bring slavery, new technologies, influxes of immigrants, refugees leaving to get away from the wars. Again, all interesting things to think about. And as you go through these, you can almost adapt your world. So if you get to day 28 and you've not thought about any previous wars, you might think, well, I've been thinking about putting like a ruined temple in this area that's ancient. Maybe there was a religious war where the current religion replaced the old one and it was quite violent. And again, this is all adding texture and detail to your campaign world. The author advises you to also consider the attitudes of society towards these wars. Are they spoken of with a sense of national pride? Are they whispered about shamelessly? So it's all stuff you can thread into like the everyday life of your player characters in your role-playing campaign. Since, let's say that they hear these rumours about this ancient ruined temple, and they go around and ask some of the locals. If you've got an idea of how the locals viewed the old religious war that replaced the old religion with the new, you can portray that accurately. And that's not to say everyone's going to be towing the party line. You might say that the majority of people who worship the current religion are quite happy with it, and they regard the previous religion as a dark, oppressive thing. But maybe there's a few people who still sort of secretly cleave to the old ways, and they're like, oh, well, it's not exactly how people were telling it. And again, that conflict can be very interesting. So we round off with looking at day 30, other historic events. And that's just getting you to think about other things that have happened in the past. So let's move on to the bonus little bits and pieces that I spoke about at the end of this book. And the bonus section is called Creating a Magic System. Now, obviously, that's not creating a magic system in the terms of creating rules, etc. for RPGs. This is talking about it from a sort of literary point of view. And the main sort of theme here is deciding how your magic system is going to work, keeping it consistent, what the rules are behind your magic system, how much of it can be divined by the characters, how widespread it is, how it can be tied into your setting, and whether any of the characters are going to have that ability themselves. And whilst none of these prompts are going to help you create the rules for a magic system, if you want to do that in like D&D or something like that, you want to replace the old Vancian magic system, you could do far worse than looking at these prompts as you're designing them, because although they don't give you a hand with the rules, they get you to think about the sort of in-character effects of a magic system in your game. So for instance, if you say that like, oh, magic's this wild, unruly thing where mages struggle to control it and frequently lose control, and the magical forces they unleash lash out, that is going to colour society's perception of magic users. Perhaps they have like a very strict regimented training regime for magic users, where only those who sort of succeed at rigorous testing are deemed worthy of being able to practice it publicly. Perhaps magic's so dangerous that magicians live as like outcasts on the edge of society because they're too dangerous to live with the rest of the normal people. Or perhaps they're even outlawed and sort of hunted down by some sort of authority or some sort of inquisition. It's all stuff that's worth thinking about and sort of tying back into your campaign setting, because at the end of the day, a set of rules for a new magic system is just a set of rules. It's how you tie it into your game and the effects it has on the plot and how the adventures of your character unfold. That's what's really going to make it sing when it comes to your campaign setting. So that's the bonus section, and there's a few other blank pages at the back for you to write some additional notes in. And then there's a little bit of a blurb about the author, who is from Devon and has been writing for a number of years. So, in my opinion, this is a really useful book to have. It costs about £7.99 British money on Amazon, and I think that's just under $10 US. It's softback, and there is a lot of blank space in it, but obviously you're supposed to use it as a workbook. You're supposed to actually write in the book. But even if you're not going to do that, like myself, because I'm not a fan of writing in books, the prompts in here are really useful and may get you thinking about some aspects of your campaign world that you had not previously considered. And it's interesting because it doesn't come straight from a sort of RPG perspective. It's done more from a literary perspective, so there's perhaps some things that are focused on a bit more in here that may be focused on a bit less in an RPG book. And yet, if you're talking about RPG systems, you're going to have to do a bit of work here because this isn't going to help you with it. But that's not the aim of it. The aim of this book is to get you thinking about the various different aspects of your world, and I think it does a great job at that. I'm really looking forward to using it for my colonial black powder setting, and hopefully I'll put up some details of that when I start doing it. So, if you're interested in 30 Days of Worldbuilding by Angeline Trevina, like I say, it's available on Amazon for £7.99 British money, which I think is about just under $10 US. Give it a look if you're creating a new campaign. As a workbook, I think it's very useful, and I think it has some great ideas in it. So until I see you next time, take care, and whatever game you're playing, have fun.